Is it a fearsome creature lurking in the murky depths of Loch Ness? Or simply a myth that has cast its long shadow across centuries? The legend of Nessie has captured imaginations for generations, weaving a tale of mystery, superstition, and intrigue. But what if the truth is more elusive than the monster itself? Tonight, we embark on our own quest to unearth the real story of the Loch Ness Monster. From ancient abbots' tales in the 7th century to the first blurry photographs and the cutting-edge science of today, the search for Nessie is as captivating as it is unexpected. Sit back, let your thoughts wander, and join us as we unravel the enigma of Loch Ness and the elusive creature that haunts its waters. Tucked up in the craggy region known as the Highlands, Loch Ness can only lay claim to being Scotland's second largest lake. The title of largest lake goes to Loch Lomond, which many of us may know from a certain popular song. At a maximum depth of 755 feet, Loch Ness is also not the deepest lake, playing second fiddle to Loch Moura. However, it is nonetheless the largest source of freshwater in the entire United Kingdom. In fact, the amount of water in Loch Ness is greater than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. In the end, its large size and impressive depth are a masterful combination. Thanks to its high peat content, the water of Loch Ness is murky. But despite the cold, it never freezes all the way across. This is because the lake is so deep. Thanks to a phenomenon called the thermocline effect, the frigid water that would usually freeze near the surface simply sinks to the bottom and is replaced by warmer water from underneath. It's easy to imagine how conditions like these would inspire a wealth of wildlife. Certainly, the loch has its share of commonplace fish, such as Atlantic salmon and different types of trout. But those deep, dark waters have also inspired legends of other more awe-inspiring creatures. And many people around the world know about one in particular. We call her the Loch Ness Monster. A 2022 article in Yahoo Finance cited an estimate that there are fewer than 10 days each year when the Loch Ness Monster does not get a mention somewhere in the world. That's an absolutely incredible statistic. But it's no more amazing than the story of how her legend came to be part of our modern lives, reaching people across the globe. The idea of a sea or river beast is not unique to the waters of Loch Ness. In fact, folktales have associated creatures like this with many bodies of water. They are sometimes labeled Loch Nebestia on old maps. Sometimes called water horses or kelpies, these animals were once thought to be both magical and ominous. One Scottish legend cautioned that the water horse would lure children onto its back and disappear with them into the depths. This was, no doubt, very useful in keeping little ones away from the water. And such beasts were not only represented in the oral tradition. In the 1st century CE, invading Romans found detailed stone carvings that the native Picts had made, showing many animals. According to an article by PBS, all the animals on those stones were easily recognizable, with the exception of one which appears to have a long mouth, a head spout, and flippers. Today, those carvings serve as the oldest existing suggestion that a beast such as the Loch Ness Monster might exist. It would be hundreds of years more before another clue about a Loch Ness creature would appear. In the 7th century, the abbot of Iona Abbey offered the first written breadcrumb on the trail to a beastie's discovery. In his biography of Saint Columba, the Irish missionary who brought Christianity to Scotland, the abbot related a tale. According to legend, Columba heard that a water beast in the River Ness had been wreaking havoc on the community. When it appeared and threatened one of his followers, he raised his hands and commanded it to go no further, "Do not touch the man, go back at once." Supposedly, the beast retreated and vanished, and both Columba and the Picts celebrated the event as a miracle. It's important to keep in mind that this biography was written 100 years after the event, by a man with a vested interest in Christianity, so he may have embellished a bit. Nonetheless, it is proof that water beasts were already part of local lore and had entered written records as early as 1,500 years ago. There's not a definite straight line from the story of St. Columba to later sightings of a beast in Loch Ness. After all, Columba's animal was supposedly in the river, not the loch. His story could have been falsely connected to events hundreds of years later. However, people did eventually begin recording things they'd spotted in the loch itself. In his 1974 book, The Loch Ness Story, future BBC correspondent Nicholas Witchell said that prior to the 20th century, he had counted about a dozen references to large animals in Loch Ness. He cast his net wide, including everything from myths to eyewitness accounts, which came on the later end of the timeline. For example, although he didn't tell the story until many years later in 1871, a man named Mackenzie of Balnine said that he saw something that looked like a log or an upturned boat wriggling and churning up water in the loch. Then, in 1888, a mason named Alexander MacDonald claimed to have spotted a large, stubby-legged animal that had surfaced and propelled itself within 50 yards of the shore. However, the real legend of the beast in Loch Ness began, arguably, in 1933. That spring, a new road had been completed, giving an unobstructed view of the water from the shore. Aldi McKay and her husband John were driving on that road when they claimed to have spotted a creature in the loch. At the time, Aldi was the manageress of the former Drumnadrochit Hotel, which is now the Loch Ness Centre. Drumnadrochit is a town on the shores of Loch Ness. Aldi subsequently described her encounter to the water bailiff, who happened to also be a part-time journalist. He then wrote an article about her account that was published in the Inverness Courier, a newspaper in the largest city and cultural capital of the Highlands. An excerpt, republished in 2017, described her account like this: "The creature disported itself, rolling and plunging for fully a minute, its body resembling that of a whale, and the water cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron. Soon, however, it disappeared in a boiling mass of foam." Both onlookers confessed that there was something uncanny about the whole thing, but they realized that here was no ordinary denizen of the depths, because, apart from its enormous size, the beast, in taking the final plunge, sent out waves that were big enough to have been caused by a passing steamer. The article further stated, "Loch Ness has for generations been credited with being the home of a fearsome-looking monster. This was the moment that the Loch Ness Monster got its enduring name." Just a few months later, a man named George Spicer reported a beast that literally crossed the road in front of him while he was driving near Loch Ness with his wife. According to the report, the animal had a huge body, about 4 feet wide and 25 feet in length. But what stood out most about his story was that the creature also had a long, wavy, narrow neck, which he estimated was thicker than an elephant's trunk, and as long as the 10 to 12-foot width of the road. In a letter to the Inverness Courier, he further colorfully described the creature as resembling a dragon or a prehistoric animal, and then rather judgmentally concluded that it was very ugly. In addition to being a land sighting, which was new, this happened to have been the first description that suggested a long-necked beast. That's a detail that stood out many decades later, when author Daniel Loxton was investigating the phenomenon. Based on Spicer's description, he noted the fact that the film King Kong had been very popular in the theaters that summer, and that the motorist's version of the monster had sounded like a long-necked dinosaur that emerged from a lake in the film. Whether or not that's true, an account of Spicer's story that appeared later that year in London's tabloid The Daily Sketch shared his dramatic insistence that he had not fabricated the sighting. He said, "I cannot think of any undertaking, any pledge that I would not accept to vouch for the truth of my statement." So either he was deluding himself or he was a truly fantastic showman. Whatever the case, Spicer's encounter made it into other papers, and interest in the Loch Ness Monster soon hit a fevered pitch. Reporters from London began to descend upon Loch Ness to investigate, and radio programs were being interrupted with Loch Ness Monster updates. A British circus offered a reward of £20,000 to anyone who could capture the beast. This prize then attracted hundreds of fortune hunters, ranging from Boy Scouts to outdoorsmen. These hopefuls surrounded the loch. They set up chairs along the shore and sent out boats, creating even more of a carnival atmosphere. Around that time, a man named Hugh Gray claimed to have captured the first photograph of the monster. However, subsequently, skeptics argued it was an otter, a swan, or even a picture of his own Labrador fetching a stick from the water. Hugh's image is not frequently mentioned in any essential history of the Loch Ness Monster. As a result, in December of 1933, the London Daily Mail commissioned an entertainment personality and big game hunter named Marmaduke Wetherall to head up to Loch Ness and get to the bottom of the mystery. With an alacrity that must have made the visiting Boy Scouts very jealous, Marmaduke advertised a major discovery only days later. He found what he characterized as freshly made footprints of a four-toed animal, which he estimated to be about 20 feet long. He quickly made plaster casts of the prints and had them sent off to the Natural History Museum in London for examination. It was a stroke of bad luck for Marmaduke that this all happened during the Christmas holiday. So, he had to wait a bit for the experts to return to the office and evaluate his specimens. The lag time was just enough for Loch Ness enthusiasts to go wild, jamming the hotels and roads of the area in feverish anticipation. But euphoria turned to crushing disappointment when the scientists got a look at the plaster casts and declared them to be the prints of a hippopotamus made using a stuffed foot attached to either an umbrella stand or an ashtray. The public may have been disappointed, but Wetherall was truly humiliated. History is not clear on whether he was the actual perpetrator of the hoax or if he'd been set up by jokesters or personal enemies. But in the wake of the embarrassing incident, the monster hunters withdrew from Loch Ness, and the legend fell out of fashion for a solid 30 years. However disreputable the idea of the monster became, though people continued to quietly make sightings and sketches at Loch Ness, despite the fact that the reporters had gone. For example, in 1934, English physician Robert Kenneth Wilson spontaneously took an iconic image now known as the surgeon's photograph. Modern listeners may recognize this picture, if they saw it, as it's probably the most famous depiction of the monster. It shows the outline of a long-necked dinosaur-like animal protruding from the loch. Many people said the creature strongly resembled a plesiosaur, a type of dinosaur that had been extinct for 65.5 million years. The plesiosaur theory is one that still pops up today, and it's easy to understand why. To modern observers, it's thrilling to imagine that a remnant of the dinosaur age managed to beat the odds and is swimming around in a body of fresh water somewhere. However, an article on History.com points out numerous reasons this appealing story is unlikely to be true. First of all, Loch Ness froze hard during recent ice ages, so a plesiosaur definitely couldn't have been living there until quite recently, in the scheme of the Earth's history. Further, that means the enormous creature would have had to swim up the comparatively small river Ness sometime in the past 10,000 years. And even if that did happen, and the Loch Ness Monster accomplished this, meeting St. Columba on the way, plesiosaurs are cold-blooded and would probably not be happy in such frigid waters as those of Loch Ness. In short, it's a theory we should probably let go. But getting back to our picture-taking position, although Wilson refused to have his name associated with it, the photograph was published in the Daily Mail in April of 1934. Despite the exposure, however, Loch Ness did not return to its former level of excitement. There seemed to be more skeptics than believers by then. It was in this climate of skepticism that one brave woman kept the home fires of Loch Ness burning for enthusiasts. In the 1950s, a local doctor named Constance White began collecting those eyewitness accounts and sketches of the beast. Her self-declared objective was the vindication of many people of integrity who had reported honestly what they had seen in Loch Ness. Standing up for friends who had been derided as witnesses in 1957, she published a book entitled More Than a Legend. It was a success, fueling renewed interest in the mystery. The year after her book was published marked the beginning of a decade full of investigations, all by respected institutions. The BBC, Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of Birmingham. The new generation of scientists and researchers came armed with more than deck chairs and binoculars. Instead, they used sonar and underwater photography to search for the beast, now affectionately called Nessie. All in all, no conclusive evidence was found. However, each expedition did note seeing large moving masses under the water at some point. Amidst those group projects, an aeronautical engineer named Tim Dinsdale visited the loch in 1960 and captured something on film, moving beneath the surface. In a move that probably raised a few eyebrows among friends and family, he gave up his career and declared that he would devote his life to uncovering the truth behind the Loch Ness Monster. It was just 2 years later that a group of monster hunters, in conjunction with author Constance White, formed a society called the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau. Their purpose was to organize watches and gather data on the loch. In 1967, World Book Encyclopedia gave them a $20,000 grant for the purpose of funding a 2-year seasonal program of daily watches. The group also encouraged amateurs to try their luck. A 1969 annual report showed that the organization had over 1,000 members, with only about half hailing from the UK. However, the society was eventually disbanded in 1972 without discovering Ness's secrets. Nonetheless, that same year, the Boston-based Academy of Applied Science picked up the torch. Led by a man named Robert Rines, who was a lawyer trained in physics, this new expedition combined sonar and strobe-lit underwater photography in an attempt to capture the legendary beast. In the process, they did get some intriguing photographs that seemed to indicate an animal with a flipper. However, the enhancement process that the photos underwent was copious, and the resulting image didn't stand up very well to scrutiny. In short, their investigation was deemed inconclusive. Subsequent images were captured the same way in 1975, and this time they attracted the attention of Sir Peter Scott, one of Britain's most well-known naturalists. Scott was excited about the photographs, and he helped Rines get a hearing with the English House of Commons to present his findings. This was a big deal because it showed that the Loch Ness Monster was finally being taken seriously. However, the skeptics descended, citing too much photo enhancement or suggesting simple human error. In their article on the subject, PBS suggests that Scott made it worse by suggesting the monster was a plesiosaur, which made the argument sound sort of preposterous. That same year, something interesting happened, but it didn't garner much attention. Ian Wetherill, the son of the disgraced Marmaduke, claimed that the famous surgeon's photograph was a fake. In an explanation that didn't make many waves, Ian said that the plot to stage the photo had involved a man named Morris Chambers. But looking back on the many pointless reports of activity at Loch Ness in the prior decades, it's easy to understand why this bulletin received little fanfare. Probably seemed like just another person looking for attention. However, the information would not be ignored forever. As PBS relates, in 1979, an art teacher named Alistair Boyd and his wife had their own chance sighting of the monster, and he became an enthusiastic student of Loch Ness lore. Later, in 1994, a friend of Alistair's named David Martin discovered the article about Ian Wetherill's claim and showed it to him. While reviewing Wetherill's statement in the newspaper article, Alistair was struck by two things that were odd. First, the man named Morris Chambers, whom Ian had mentioned as an accomplice, was the very person who had been hosting Kenneth Wilson on the visit where he'd taken the picture. The second thing Alistair noticed was that when Ian had talked about the photo, he had mentioned the shoreline being visible in the background. Alistair had actually seen that picture before, having tracked it down in the archives in the 1980s. He knew that, in fact, the original photo had shown the shoreline as Ian claimed. But after being published only once, a new cropped version had been widely circulated that only showed the monster close up. The uncropped version with the shoreline had only been published in 1934, so long beforehand that Ian could never have known unless he had an absolutely incredible memory or if he had been there. Alistair and David couldn't talk to Ian anymore, as he had since passed away. However, they were able to interview his stepbrother, Christian Sperling, a 93-year-old man who was living in England. Clearly wishing to unburden himself, Sperling admitted that the photo was a fake. He said that his stepfather, Marmaduke, had been set on taking revenge on the Daily Mail after his humiliation regarding the hippo footprint fiasco. It's unclear whether the Wetherills roped in Kenneth Wilson or simply set him up to take the photo without his knowledge. Some newspaper articles even allege that the Wetherills took the photo themselves and simply convinced Wilson to be their frontman. We may never know, but Sperling, who was a sculpture specialist, claims that he and his father and stepbrother Ian manufactured an animal using a model dinosaur head and then attached it to a toy submarine purchased at Woolworths. Once the photos of their model beast had been taken, Sperling claims they sank the submarine by stepping on it, leaving it forever in the depths of the loch. Reportedly, Morris Chambers then convinced Wilson to sell the photos to the paper, and the rest was history. And it was history that seemed pretty reliable up until Alistair debunked the surgeon's photograph quite convincingly 60 years later. His revelations were printed in newspapers around the world, and the picture fell out of favor. You would think, after uncovering fraud in such a hallowed piece of evidence, that Alistair Boyd would have lost faith in the idea that one or more beasts were roaming Loch Ness. After all, most people now consider that classic photo to be a hoax, but nothing could be further from the truth. Boyd still believes in the beast, even though that particular image was fake. He told PBS, "I am so convinced in the reality of these creatures that I would actually stake my life on their existence." Of his own sighting, he said, "It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life, and if I could afford to spend the rest of my life looking for another glimpse of it, I would." Alistair was not the only one who still yearned to prove the existence of Nessie. As the years continued, technology evolved. A search sponsored by the BBC in 2003 employed 60 sonar beams and satellite tracking. These tools would have detected an object as small as a boy. However, the expedition still came up empty-handed, further putting the existence of the monster in question. In 2016, the Loch Ness Project in Visit Scotland sponsored a study using an underwater robot to probe the depths. Ironically, the device only found a sunken Nessie prop that had once been used in the 1970 movie The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. 2 years later, researchers from multiple universities came together to try an entirely new approach. They tested the loch for DNA evidence. The results were disappointing. Not only was no reptile DNA discovered, but they didn't even find DNA for large fish like sharks, sturgeons, or catfish. There was, however, lots of DNA to indicate the presence of eels. In a surprising twist, there was also no otter or seal DNA. Looking back at the number of skeptics who attributed sightings to one of those two animals, this is an interesting data point to consider. What does that leave? An eel of unusual size? Can't be ruled out. The researchers suggested another reason for the plethora of eel DNA, which was basically quantity over quality. In 2023, a high-tech event was staged at Loch Ness in honor of the 90th anniversary of Aldi Mackay's famous 1933 sighting. Sonar, thermal imaging, drone, and hydrophones were deployed to comb the loch from top to bottom. Despite the large turnout of searchers, the people in attendance and the hundreds who watched the live stream online were again disappointed. No monster was found. Nonetheless, the allure of Nessie endures. According to a 2018 study, tourism related to the Loch Ness Monster brings in roughly $52 million per year. So, there are some in Scotland who probably don't mind continuing the search. After all, from the jokesters to the serious scientists to the eager scouts who hoped for glory, when it comes to discovering the Loch Ness Monster, it's the effort that seems to matter more than the results. In late 2023, Paige Daly, who describes herself as the official keeper of the Register of Sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, was interviewed by BBC Scotland. She inherited the title and management of the official Loch Ness Monster fan club from her father, Gary Campbell, who started it in the 1990s. In the interview, Daly said, "Nessie has really been there my whole life, and I'm really honored now to take it on." As a younger Nessie enthusiast, Daly has brought the search to social media, engaging followers of many generations with her good-natured and exciting videos. An NBC article about the 2023 anniversary search quoted one enthusiast as saying, "The search is really just about having fun, keeping faith, and exploring the natural world." That description certainly fits most of the former investigators in one way or another. But maybe, just maybe, there's a deeper aspect to it. As the article's author poignantly concludes, like the surface of a lake, the Loch Ness legend seems to reflect the hopes of those who gaze into it. And as long as Nessie hasn't been found, that hope lives on.